There's a moment in every courtroom drama where silence becomes louder than any words ever could. This is one of those moments. A man who gave away everything he had to save a stranger child was about to lose everything he built with his own two hands. And the only person who could save him was the very girl he once found sleeping under a bridge, starving, alone, and forgotten by the world. What she was about to do in that courtroom would leave every single person in that room in tears. Stay with me, because this story is about to show you why one small act of kindness can quietly change the entire course of a life. Before we continue, if stories like this move your heart, please take a second to hit subscribe and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it lets us keep bringing you real, heartfelt stories about kindness, family, and second chances. And I would love to hear from you. So drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from today. This channel is called Kindness Waves, and if you're new here, welcome. You're about to see exactly why we chose that name. Now, let's get into the story. It was a cold November evening in Ohio, the kind of evening where the wind cuts through your jacket, no matter how many layers you're wearing. Daniel Hayes was driving home from his small hardware store, exhausted after a 16-hour day, his mind already on the stack of unpaid bills waiting for him on the kitchen table. He was 34 years old, a single father raising his 6-year-old son, Ethan, ever since his wife had passed away from an illness 2 years earlier. Life had not been gentle with Daniel. He worked from sunrise until long after sunset, trying to keep his little hardware store alive while also being both mother and father to his son. That night, as he stopped at a red light near the edge of downtown, something caught his eye. Underneath the overpass, curled up against a concrete pillar, was a small figure wrapped in a torn blanket. At first, he thought it was a stray dog, but as the light from a nearby street lamp flickered, he realized it was a child. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, shivering, her lips pale from the cold, her small hands tucked under her arms trying to keep warm. Daniel's heart sank. He looked around, half expecting to see a parent nearby, someone who had just stepped away for a moment. But there was no one, just this small girl, alone in the dark, in weather that could kill a grown man if he stayed out too long. The light turned green. Cars behind him honked. And for a split second, Daniel almost drove on, telling himself that this wasn't his problem, but he already had enough weight on his shoulders, that a single father barely keeping his business afloat had no business getting involved in something so much bigger than himself. But he couldn't do it. He pulled his truck over, hazard lights blinking, and walked toward the little girl. She flinched when she saw him coming, pulling the blanket tighter around her thin shoulders, her eyes wide with fear and suspicion, the kind of look that only comes from a child who has already learned that the world is not always safe. Daniel said softly, crouching down so he wasn't towering over her. "It's really cold out here. Are you okay? Where's your mom or dad?" The girl didn't answer. She just stared at him, her body trembling, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. Daniel noticed her shoes were falling apart, her jacket too thin for the season, and there was a small backpack beside her that looked like it held everything she owned in the world. He didn't push her for answers. Instead, he took off his own jacket and gently placed it over her shoulders. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I have a little boy about your age at home, and we're about to have some hot soup. You're welcome to come warm up, just for a little while. No pressure. I just don't feel right leaving you out here in this cold." It took nearly 10 minutes of gentle coaxing before the girl finally, hesitantly, took his hand. Her name, she eventually whispered, was Lily. She was 7 years old. Her mother had died from an overdose 8 months earlier, and after that, she had bounced between distant relatives who didn't want the burden of another mouth to feed, until finally, 2 weeks ago, she had simply been left behind at a bus station with nothing but her backpack and a note that said someone would come back for her. No one ever did. Daniel felt something crack open in his chest that night, something he couldn't fully explain even to himself. He brought Lily home, fed her, let her take a warm bath, and gave her some of his son Ethan's old pajamas to wear. He called the local police and child services that same night, doing everything by the book, expecting that they would take her somewhere safe, some kind of foster home or shelter, and that would be the end of it. But over the next few days, something happened that Daniel didn't expect. Lily wouldn't stop looking at him with those wide, hopeful eyes every time he checked in on her at the temporary shelter the social worker had placed her in. Ethan, his own son, kept asking when his new sister was coming home, and Daniel found himself lying awake at night, unable to stop thinking about that small trembling girl under the bridge, wondering what would happen to her, whether she would end up bounced from home to home for the rest of her childhood, whether anyone would ever choose her the way a family should. 3 weeks later, against the advice of nearly everyone in his life, including his own mother who worried he couldn't afford to feed one more mouth, Daniel Hayes filed for emergency foster placement and eventually formal adoption. His accountant told him he was out of his mind. His sister reminded him that his hardware store was already drowning in debt, that he could barely keep the lights on for himself and Ethan, let alone take on another child with no income of her own and a traumatic past that would need years of healing. Daniel's response was simple. She doesn't have anyone. I can't just leave her out there. It wasn't an easy road. Lily struggled with nightmares for months. She flinched at loud noises, hoarded food in her room out of fear it would disappear, and had trouble trusting that this new life was actually real and not just another temporary stop before she'd be abandoned again. Daniel worked even harder those first 2 years, taking on side jobs, fixing neighbors' fences, and repairing appliances on weekends just to afford therapy sessions for Lily, on top of running his store and raising both kids. But slowly, so slowly that some days it felt like nothing was changing at all, Lily began to heal. She started calling Ethan her little brother. She began sleeping through the night without waking up in a panic. She started drawing pictures of their small house with the words "My home" written across the top in careful, childish handwriting. And one evening, nearly a year after that cold night under the bridge, she walked up to Daniel while he was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen, tugged on his sleeve, and asked quietly if it would be okay if she called him Dad. Daniel had to excuse himself to the garage that night so his kids wouldn't see him cry. The years that followed were far from perfect, but they were full. Daniel's hardware store, which he had built from nothing after taking out a second mortgage on a small house, slowly grew from a single struggling storefront into a small regional chain. He named it Hayes Home and Hardware, and by the time Lily turned 15, there were 4 locations across Ohio, each one built on the same values Daniel had raised his kids with: honesty, hard work, and treating every single customer like family. He often told his employees that the store wasn't just about selling tools and lumber. It was about building something that would still matter long after he was gone. Lily grew into a bright, determined young woman. She excelled in school, particularly in her business and accounting classes, often staying up late at the kitchen table doing homework right alongside her father as he went over the store's books. She used to joke that she'd inherited his stubbornness, the same refusal to give up even when things looked impossible. Ethan, 2 years younger, grew into a quieter, more artistic soul, but the bond between the three of them, this family built not by blood but by choice, only grew stronger with every passing year. Daniel never remarried. He always said that raising Ethan and Lily was enough love to fill any life twice over. He poured every ounce of himself into that hardware store empire and into his 2 children, determined that Lily would never again know what it felt like to be forgotten, and that Ethan would grow up watching what it truly meant to be a good man. By the time Lily turned 21, she had graduated with a degree in business finance, and instead of taking a high-paying job at some big city firm, as many of her professors had urged her to do, she came home. She joined Hayes Home and Hardware as an operations manager, determined to help her father's dream keep growing the same way he had once helped save her life. But not everyone in Daniel's life had been as loyal as his daughter. For years, Daniel had a business partner named Richard Colton, a smooth-talking man he had brought on as an investor back when the second store was struggling to get off the ground. Richard had provided capital at a time when Daniel desperately needed it, and in exchange, he became a 30% shareholder in the growing company. On the surface, their partnership seemed solid. Richard showed up to store openings, shook hands with local reporters, and played the role of the supportive business partner. But underneath, Richard had grown resentful over the years, watching Daniel's name become synonymous with the company's success while his own contribution faded into the background. As the business grew larger, so did Richard's greed. He began quietly maneuvering behind the scenes, forming alliances with a couple of minority shareholders, feeding them doubts about Daniel's leadership, suggesting that an aging small-town store owner with no formal business education couldn't possibly scale a company that was now worth tens of millions of dollars. He painted himself as the modern, forward-thinking partner who could take Hayes Home and Hardware to the next level, if only Daniel could be pushed out of the picture. When Lily was 22, everything came to a head. Richard filed a lawsuit against Daniel, claiming that Daniel had mismanaged company funds, that he had made unauthorized decisions that hurt shareholder value, and demanding that the court remove Daniel as CEO and force a sale of his majority shares, a sale that, conveniently, Richard and his allies were already lined up to purchase at a steep discount. It was in every sense an attempt to steal the empire Daniel had built out of nothing, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, starting from a single struggling storefront and a stubborn refusal to give up on a homeless little girl he found shivering under a bridge. Daniel was devastated, not because he feared losing money. He had never cared much about being wealthy, but because he feared losing the one thing he had built to make sure his children and every employee who depended on that company for their livelihood would always have something stable to stand on. Nearly 600 families depended on those 4, now 8, store locations for their income. If Richard won this lawsuit and forced a hostile sale, there was no guarantee those jobs, or the culture of decency Daniel had spent 2 decades building, would survive. The legal battle dragged on for months. Richard's lawyers were sharp, expensive, and ruthless, twisting simple decisions Daniel had made over the years, like giving struggling employees paid time off during personal emergencies or extending credit to loyal customers during hard times, into evidence of what they called reckless financial mismanagement. Daniel, who had never been comfortable in boardrooms or courtrooms, who had built his life on handshake deals and looking people in the eye, felt completely out of his depth. That's when Lily stepped in. She had spent the last year, quietly and without telling her father the full extent of it, pursuing an additional certification in forensic accounting on nights and weekends, driven by a nagging feeling that something wasn't right with how Richard had been handling certain financial reports. When the lawsuit was filed, she didn't panic. She got to work. For weeks, Lily buried herself in years of financial records, board meeting minutes, shareholder agreements, and bank statements. She barely slept. She turned the family's dining room into a war room, covered wall to wall with printed spreadsheets and sticky notes. She hired an independent forensic auditor with her own savings to cross-check her findings, refusing to let her personal closeness to the case cloud her judgment. And slowly, piece by piece, she uncovered something that changed everything. Richard Colton hadn't just been trying to seize control of the company through legal pressure. He had been quietly siphoning funds for years, funneling money through a shell consulting firm that billed the company for services that were never actually performed. The very financial mismanagement he accused Daniel of was, in reality, a smokescreen for Richard's own embezzlement, carefully disguised within reports he had personally overseen as the company's financial liaison. Lily found the paper trail, the falsified invoices, the offshore account transfers, all of it meticulously documented and cross-referenced. The day of the final court hearing arrived on a bright, cold morning in March. The courtroom was packed. Employees from all 8 Hayes Home and Hardware locations had shown up in support of Daniel, many of them taking unpaid time off work just to be there. Richard sat confidently at his table, flanked by his expensive legal team, certain that the judge would rule in his favor given the mountain of doubt his lawyers had cast over the last several months. Daniel sat quietly beside his own attorney, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his heart heavy with the fear that after everything, after 2 decades of sacrifice, he might actually lose it all. He glanced over at Lily, sitting in the front row, dressed sharply in a navy blue blazer, a thick folder clutched in her hands, and he gave her a small, tired smile, the same reassuring smile he used to give her when she was 7 years old and scared of the dark. When the judge called for any final evidence to be presented, Lily's attorney, the one she had insisted on hiring separately to represent her formal findings, stood and requested permission for Lily Hayes to present forensic evidence directly to the court. Richard's lawyers objected, clearly caught off guard, but the judge allowed it. Lily walked to the front of the courtroom, her legs shaking slightly beneath her composed exterior, and for a brief moment, she looked out at her father. In that instant, she wasn't thinking about spreadsheets or shell companies. She was thinking about a cold night under a bridge, about a stranger's jacket wrapped around her trembling shoulders, about a man who had every reason in the world to keep driving that night and didn't. 15 years ago, Lily began, her voice steady despite the tears already forming in her eyes. A man found me freezing under a bridge with nothing to my name but a backpack and a note nobody ever came back for. He didn't know me. He owed me nothing. But he gave me his jacket, brought me into his home, and chose me as his daughter when the entire world had already decided I wasn't worth choosing. The courtroom fell completely silent. Today, she continued, I'm not just an operations manager for this company. I am a daughter, standing here to make sure the man who saved my life doesn't lose the one thing he built to make sure other people's children never have to feel as alone as I did that night. She then laid out, methodically and without a single wasted word, the evidence she had uncovered. The shell company, the falsified invoices, the offshore transfers, the timeline that proved beyond doubt that Richard Colton, not Daniel Hayes, had been the one betraying the company's shareholders and employees for years. Richard's face went pale as the documents were entered into evidence one by one. His lawyers scrambled, but the paper trail Lily had assembled was airtight, cross-verified by an independent forensic auditor whose sworn testimony corroborated every single claim. By the end of that day, the judge didn't just dismiss Richard's lawsuit against Daniel. Based on the overwhelming evidence Lily had presented, the court referred the case for a full criminal investigation into Richard Colton's embezzlement and issued an emergency order freezing his shares and removing him from any position of authority within the company, pending the outcome of that investigation. When the judge finally read the ruling, the courtroom erupted, not in the chaotic way you might see in a movie, but in a quiet, overwhelming wave of relief. Employees who had shown up to support their boss wiped away tears. Daniel's longtime store manager, a woman who had worked for him since the very first location opened, openly sobbed into her husband's shoulder. Daniel walked over to Lily, his own eyes streaming with tears he no longer bothered to hide, and wrapped her in a hug so tight it seemed to hold 15 years of love inside it. "You saved me," he whispered into her hair. Lily shook her head against his shoulder. "No, Dad," she said. "You saved me first. I just returned the favor." In the months that followed, Hayes Home and Hardware not only survived, it thrived. Freed from Richard's quiet sabotage, the company expanded into 3 new states, and Daniel, now in his early 50s, slowly began stepping back from daily operations, handing more and more responsibility to Lily, whose reputation as a sharp, principled leader had already begun to spread throughout the industry. Ethan, who had grown into a talented graphic designer, took over rebranding the company's stores, adding his own creative fingerprint to the family legacy. But perhaps the most meaningful change came quietly, away from courtrooms and boardrooms altogether. Daniel and Lily started a small foundation together, funded by a portion of the company's profits, dedicated to providing emergency shelter, warm clothing, and long-term foster placement support for homeless and displaced children across Ohio. They named it, fittingly, the Bridge Foundation, in honor of the very spot where their story had begun on that freezing November night so many years ago. At the foundation's launch event, a local reporter asked Daniel what had made him stop his truck that night, when so many others had likely driven past that same overpass without a second glance. Daniel thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I didn't have much back then," he said. "I was barely keeping my own life together. But I've learned that kindness was never really about having extra to give. It's about deciding, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's scary, even when everyone tells you it's not your problem, that another person's pain matters enough to stop for." He looked over at Lily, now standing confidently beside him in a sharp blazer, a successful executive, a loving sister, a woman who had once been a frightened little girl with nowhere left to turn. I thought I was the one saving her that night, he said. But the truth is, she's been saving me right